Okay, guys, this is a guide to question 2, Nazi Germany A-level history, and this is the question that looks at historical debate. Okay, so just a quick reminder of what you're looking for in the exam. So obviously you'd have done question 1 that gives you 3 sources, and you can see just on the bottom half of this past paper exam script that you have multiple choice questions. So we'll run through that in a second. 30 marks, it's important that you only answer one of them. That's the most important thing. I have seen candidates in the past struggle through 2, so it's advantageous that you have multiple choice, but obviously just answer 1. Okay, so let's dive straight into it. Some of the different types of questions that you could have for question 2. This is an example of what I call an iceberg question. In other words, the question appears to be about something quite small. So in this case, the use of terror. But actually, the bottom of the iceberg is what the essay is actually about. It's giving you a factor, it's giving you an event, it's giving you a little bit of a nudge to talk about something, but actually the question is about something much bigger. So in this case, the use of terror was the main factor in the Nazi domestic control from 33 to 39. So this question is actually asking you about Nazi domestic control from 33 to the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, with terror being one of those factors. Another example was to what extent, so again, the wording is slightly different, but what you'll notice with these questions is that the examiner's trying to encourage you to think about making a judgment. So to what extent, or do you agree, or discuss? It's asking you for a debate and it's asking you for your historical opinion, which is why judgments are so important, which we'll have a look at in a little bit. Anyway, to what extent was the decision to invade the Soviet Union the main reason why Germany lost the Second World War? Very similar. The question is actually looking for you to debate and evaluate Germany's loss in the Second World War, and they give you one of those reasons to begin with. How far do you agree? Again, slightly different wording, but again, it's a judgment question. That Nazi social policy was successful in creating the Volga mine shaft from 33 to 45. A little bit different there, not so much of an iceberg question. They're not really giving you a factor, and we'll break that one down in a couple of minutes' time. And finally, the invasion of Poland was the most significant development in the final solution from 33 to 43. Discuss. So all of these types of questions are clearly debate questions. They're asking you to bring in your own historical knowledge, and they're asking you to bring in a judgment. The good news is, in terms of structure in this essay, it's pretty straightforward in terms of an overall structure guide. So you need an introduction, you need a conclusion, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, and basically you're going to have a handful of sections. I would say a minimum of, minimum of 2, but really looking for 3 sections, probably a maximum of 5, depending on what the essay is and how much you write. But as a general guide, it's a fairly straightforward essay in terms of overall structure. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these questions and we'll plan them together and we'll see how straightforward this can be. Obviously, all this goes without saying that your knowledge is good. Okay, so make sure your revision is sound because these questions are very difficult if you don't know your stuff. Okay, to what extent was the decision to invade the Soviet Union the main reason why Germany lost the Second World War? So, as I mentioned previously, this is a question where they're asking you to debate the reasons why Germany lost the Second World War. Now, I would always open up with the factor or the event that they give you. So, in this case, for those of you who know your stuff, Operation Barbarossa was the code name given to the invasion of the Soviet Union. So it makes sense to start in section 1 and evaluate how significant that was. So some examples, you could talk about the fact that it led Germany to fight a war on 2 fronts, the fact that Hitler underestimated the Red Army during this excursion, and the decision to attack Stalingrad, which many historians criticize as a poor mistake and a poor decision. You could then bring in a different factor because remember, you're debating here, and this is in the second part of your essay where you're bringing in a counter argument. And in this case, I'm going to argue that actually Hitler's poor leadership was a significant factor also. So I could bring in the fact that he constantly ignored the advice of his generals, that his decision making was usually ideologically driven instead of being tactically sound. And I could also bring in some case studies such as his mistakes potentially at Dunkirk to let the British Army go, or the Battle of Britain where he didn't use the full might of the Luftwaffe. I'm also then going to bring in another factor, which is another counter argument, well, and asking, well, what about the significance of the Allied success and military successes? So again, I could bring in victories at Dunkirk, Battle of Britain, the D-Day landings, the Blitz Spirit, and also the fact that the US joined the war. And what I have there is a pretty good debate, which I'm bringing in a number of different factors, and I can certainly create a debate from those different types of sections. This one's a little bit different. How far do you agree that Nazi social policy was successful in creating the Volska mineshaft? 33 to 45. So I would look at that and I think, right, this doesn't look quite like the other one where they give you a factor. It's not quite as obvious. They're asking us to debate here Nazi social policy and whether it's successful or not. So I've got to step back. It's a little bit more tricky and think, what exactly were the areas of Nazi social policy that I can debate and evaluate? And you start to think about it, and maybe your mind will lead to, because they don't give you one in this question, what about the extensive policies of German youth? So what you could do in this section, again, to create a little mini debate, is you could talk about the successes that Nazis had with groups like the Hitler Youth, the League of German Maidens, but then perhaps bring in a bit of a counter argument and talk about some of the youth opposition groups, particularly like the Edelweiss Pirates and the Swing Kids. So you've got a little debate within a debate there, where you're talking about the section of youth overall, but you're going to bring in a little debate within that section, which I think would be quite clever. Then you step back and think, okay, so I've created a little debate about whether the youth was successful or not. What other social policies were there? Women could be another example, and in this instance, you could talk about the successes of the 3K policy, the role of women, and then you could also bring in a counter argument, again, a debate within a debate in terms of, the birth rate targets were not always met, and not all women kind of bowed to the Nazi regime like the majority did. Then potentially bring in an argument about the social policy in terms of the members of the church and the church itself. So you could talk about the Concordat, which was the agreement made with the Catholic Church. You could talk about the extensive repression of Jews that the Nazis undertook. But then you could also bring in a counter argument of people like Martin Niemöller and Jewish resistance as examples of perhaps policy being unsuccessful. And then maybe a fourth section, and I'm trying to show you essays here. Some of them have 3 sections, some of them have 4, some of them might have 5. So asocials, again, you could argue that the Nazis had an extensive genocidal program, the final solution, the concentration camps, but also the fact that there were survivors, there were some resistors. And what you're looking to do then is come to an overall conclusion, consider all of those different mini debates, and come to a judgment on how successful it was. Usually with these essays, you would arrive at a balanced judgment. So in this instance, I would argue that to a large extent they did. However, there were obviously limitations, and also the fact that the regime fell in 1945, so you could counter-argue that. But there's no right answer. Let's have a look at another one. So the invasion of Poland was the most significant development in the final solution between 33 and 43. So here we have a racial policy, and more specific, the treatment of the Jews question. This is back to our iceberg question, where they're showing you the tip of the iceberg. In this instance, it is the invasion of Poland. So it would make sense to start there. So we would talk about, and you would bring in some examples of the fact that now the Nazis occupied many, many more Jews, and now more Jews were part of their territory, and you could argue that it was significant in that way. You could then bring out create a debate and bring out examples of why the Nuremberg laws were so significant in 1935, arguing maybe that this was the beginning of legal persecution, the first time where the state legally got involved in persecution of the Jews. Kristallnacht is a massive one. Okay, 1938, this was state-sponsored violence against Jewish people and their property. You could certainly make a strong argument for that. The Wannsee Conference, if you know a little bit about that, some historians point to this as being the point where the decision for genocide and mass murder was decided upon, and it brought in the final solution as a result of that. Or you could argue finally that it was the final solution itself after 1942, which is the most significant development, because this was when mass genocide took place. Again, when you arrive at the judgment, you could pick one of those. You could pick a combination of those, or you could arrive at a balanced judgment. There's no wrong answer as long as you are making one. Okay, so let's have a little look at the question here, because this is going to be an example we look at. So the use of terror was the main factor in Nazi domestic policies. So this is the one we spoke about a little bit earlier. And let's imagine that your essay looks a little bit like this. You're going to talk about terror first, and you're going to bring the examples, for example, of Gestapo, SS, denunciations, the Long Knives, and the Reichstag fire, all examples of the use of terror. You could argue that propaganda was a main factor in controlling the German people. You could talk about the censorship, propaganda within art, literature, rallies, the role of Minister Joseph Goebbels, for example. Also bring in another factor, which is, the social policies that they brought in were a main factor in terms of control as well. And then finally, you could argue that legislation played a key role. Things like the Reichstag decrees after the Reichstag fire, the Nuremberg laws in 35, the banning of political parties, and oppression and repression of opposition. So let's imagine this is the essay we're going to have a little look at, and that's roughly where we would how we would structure our essay. So something I want to talk to you about is that we've talked about essay structure and different sections and how we can use different examples within the essay. But if you were to get those top marks, you've got to aim for what the examiner calls a sustained judgment. Now, there's a number of ways of doing this, okay? The most obvious one is you provide a judgment in your introduction. So straight away, when you're writing an introduction, there is a clear judgment at the beginning. And what you should find is your essay proves that judgment and links back to that judgment, and then your conclusion wraps it all up and confirms your judgment at the end. But let's break it down a little bit. So let's say I'm answering this question and I'm sat in the exam and I've got 20 seconds of thinking time, and I think, right, what is my judgment going to be? Am I going to agree that terror was the most important factor? Am I going to say it was a combination of terror and propaganda? How am I going to say social policy was the most important? But what I've decided to do for this essay is I think it's a combination of lots of those things. And actually, I'm going to argue that all of these things, terror, propaganda, the social policies, and the repressive legislation, created a climate of fear in Germany that I'm going to argue was the most important factor in terms of domestic control. So as I said, you can agree with one of the factors, or you can come up with something completely unique, which I'm going to attempt to do here. So there's 3 golden rules to the introduction. The first one is you have to address the question. You should be able to read your introduction out loud to someone, and they should be able to know what the question is, even if you hadn't told them beforehand. Try and outline the debate or address the debate that you're going to conduct as much as possible, and then possibly the obvious one, try and make a clear judgment in there. It doesn't have to be a one-sided judgment. It can be more balanced or nuanced, but it does have to be clearly a judgment where you're addressing the question. Let's have a look how simple this can be. The statement that terror was the main reason for the Nazi domestic control from 1933 to 1939 is valid to an extent. So what this student has done here, okay, is not only address the question, but there's a judgment there quite quickly. They're addressing the question and saying that that is a valid statement to make. However, it is only valid to an extent. So this is where the outline of the debate comes. Nazi state control was achieved by using a variety of factors, including propaganda, Hitler's leadership, economic success, repression of opposition, and social policies. So there's an attempt there to outline the fact that this debate is going to be looking at a variety of different factors. And this is the important bit. Overall, the reason for Nazi control was a combination of factors, the use of terror being one of them, that led to a climate of fear in Germany. So this the student is now leaning towards their judgment, and this is where it comes very, very clearly. This climate of fear was the main reason for domestic control in Nazi Germany. So that's not a lot of writing there, but that is so precise, and it does everything that you need it to do. It addresses the question, outlines the debate, and makes a very clear judgment. So we're going to do one of these sections. We won't go through the whole essay, obviously, because there's a pattern there. And we're going to have a look at the terror section and how you might set this out. Now, it's not as prescriptive as other history essays. You don't have to follow this exactly. But if you just want a little bit of guidance in how you can make your way through one of these sections, the tried and tested PLJ formula works quite well. So in real simple terms, you're looking to introduce a sentence that makes a clear point that addresses the question or introduces that section. I'll show you an example in a minute. The E's are next to each other because they're not mutually exclusive. They're going to be intertwined and you're going to be doing this at the same time. You are going to be explaining why terror is a factor whilst using examples. So it's side by side. And the final one, L and J, are also side by side because you're going to be doing these at the same time as well. This is where you are finishing your section and linking back to the question or linking to another factor whilst making a clear judgment. If that's slightly confusing, let's break it down and hopefully this appears a lot more simple. Look how easy this can be. This is the point section. The use of terror was a crucial element in maintaining Nazi domestic control. Addresses the question directly and outlines that this section you're going to be talking clearly about the use of terror. The Nazi regime created a vast network of secret police, including the Gestapo, who were tasked with suppressing dissent and executing those who were seen as a threat to the regime. So this is where this student is now beginning to explain, given an example of the Gestapo, why terror was so effective. For example, during the Night of the Long Knives, June 30th, 1934, Hitler ordered the assassination of Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, a parliamentary organisation that had become a liability to the regime. Hitler saw Röhm as a potential rival and feared that he could challenge his leadership. In coordination campaign, the Gestapo arrested and executed over 200 members of the SA, along with other political opponents. So again, there's quite a bit of own knowledge in there, but it's also quite precise. This don't get confused, don't get mistaken and think, oh well, this is narrative now. This person's just telling a story. Not really. Okay, this is bringing in a very specific example and taking 3 or 4 lines to add own knowledge of why this was a good use of terror. Similar things done for a second time. Another example was Kristallnacht that took place on November 1938. This was when the Nazis launched a coordinated attack on Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues across Germany. The attack, which was orchestrated by the Gestapo, resulted in the destruction of thousands of businesses and the murder of over 90 Jews. The attack was used to justify the persecution of Jews and to create a climate of fear and intimidation. So what you have there is some pretty good knowledge, 2 or 3 really good examples, Gestapo, Night of the Long Knives and Kristallnacht, and it doesn't stray off into the narrative, but this is the clever and important bit. This is the link and the judgment. It is clear that the use of terror was an important factor in Nazi state control. Addresses the question. Alongside a program of systemic propaganda, the use of terror only further created a climate of fear amongst German citizens and potential opponents of the Nazis. So why that is so clever and subtle is this student has acknowledged the use of terror, also brought in a link to propaganda, saying they work side by side, but then is making a mini judgment and saying these 2 things produced the climate of fear. And if you can remember, that was the judgment in the introduction by the student. So we're going to skip to the end of the essay and we are now going to conclude. This is how straightforward it can be. In conclusion, terror was a crucial element in maintaining Nazi domestic control, but it was one of several important factors, addresses the question, outlines the complexity of the debate. The use of terror, Hitler's leadership, economic success, repression of opposition, and social policies all played significant roles in maintaining Nazi control. This is the important bit. A more suitable conclusion, or you can write the word interpretation or judgment, whatever you want, or view. A more suitable conclusion would be that Nazi domestic control was possible by creating a climate of fear amongst its citizens. That was the result of a variety of factors such as propaganda and terror. I mean, it's a fantastic conclusion for me. This student is combining all the factors to create a new interpretation, a new judgment, and is arguing very clearly through the essay that yes, terror was important. Yes, propaganda was important. Of course, repression was important. Social policies were important. But all of these things created something much bigger, which was fear in Germany, which this candidate is arguing was the most important factor. Okay, so if we just summarize the important bits. So you need an introduction in this question. It needs to address the question and outline the debate. You need to try your very best to create a substantiated judgment. The best ways of doing that, a clear judgment in your introduction and conclusion, and in your mini judgments as you go through, try and link back to your judgment and the question. The more precise and better and accurate your knowledge, obviously the better. And the more The more well selected your examples is better as well. Remain focused on the question. So if you use Kristallnacht as an example, you need to be sharp and precise. Don't write a page about Kristallnacht. Link factors or events wherever possible. So if terror is important and propaganda was important, can you write a sentence and say how they were linked in some way? Linking factors and creating a more nuanced debate is very, very important. What you are trying to do, in essence, with any of these questions is create some sort of debate. Are you comparing factors, comparing events, linking them together, and coming up with a clear judgment in your conclusion? Okay, hopefully that was useful.